This morning, I was having a think about what it means when we find ourselves living for others versus living for ourselves. Another way of looking at this, another way people often label this, is internal validation versus external validation. I don't know if those labels are as precise as we need them to be in this specific podcast episode, because I want to have a little think about, let's say, the negative aspects of external validation, and then perhaps also allow some time to think about the positive aspects. I also want to really unpack my experience with internal validation, my recent experiences, and perhaps some other ones. Perhaps it is the case that one way we can look at these concepts is through a positive and a negative label. Or perhaps we might find that we want to shift the labeling system a bit or I might want to shift the labeling system a bit to fit a bit more my perspective. For instance, just off the top of my head, if we look at the phrase living for others versus the phrase using the approval of others to offer a secondary confirmation to something you already know or already have experienced, then the labeling might need to shift at that point, because the first one, living for others, from the phrase itself, it sounds like the negative aspect of external validation. Part of the reason why I'm thinking about this today is because I certainly often find myself or catch myself waiting for somebody or a group of somebodies to offer me their approval before I then think something is good or bad or otherwise. An example of this arose yesterday, but I will keep it vague in the interest of kind of not raising attention to any specific individual and more to focus simply on the narrative at play, let's say. So in this example, I had a long day, and to end that day, or at the end of that day rather, I was seeking approval from somebody in my life to relax my mind and body, to let go. Perhaps it was partly due to the fact that I was quite drained by the end of the day, but I noticed a part of me tightly clinging to the prospect of a certain individual's approval so that I could be free. When I became aware of that part of me that was tightly clinging to that external validation, in the negative definition, the living for others kind of external validation, I started to explore what was happening there. Could I potentially respond to this part of me that was waiting for another person's certain words to allow myself to relax? Why I might have felt the need to tightly cling, as though almost there was a fear of this person's approval wouldn't come through, as though I desperately needed it to be okay, to be me in a sense. And in that exploration, I noticed that when I started to reflect on why what I did was good enough, on the various steps that were involved in the tasks I was responsible for, I started to notice a bit of a softening in that tightness, as though really the need behind it all in that moment was there was a part of me needing to tell it, you're okay, you've done a good job. And intertwined with that was a kind of habit of, I need to get this from outside of me, from another source. But as somewhat noted before, who said that can't be a secondary source along with a primary source of confirmation or validation that is you, that is the you that can look back on, hey, what have I done today or this week? Was that a good use of my time? Was that me fulfilling my sense of duty and responsibility to the various things I engage with? And you can embody a state of affirming these things, a state of telling yourself, yes, that was quite good. That was quite a good effort. Oh, we slipped a little there, but we made it up, a couple of hours later. And perhaps that was a kind of needed experience to have, or it had its reasons to be there. But all in all, today or last week, you did a great job. And you'll find if you are having this physical sensation of needing validation, of I can't relax until someone tells me I'm good, I'm okay, you will find that you can speak to that need in you in one way or another, in however form you might like to do such a thing. It could be direct, it could be indirect, it could be journaling, it could be affirmations, it could be a voice note to yourself, it could be indirect, it could be you're rewarding yourself with an activity that fills you in a certain way, drawing with peaceful lo-fi music in the background, playing a new video game that you have gotten, calling up a friend to see what they're doing, basically signaling to that part of you that yes, indeed, you can relax, you are good, you have done a good job. But whether indirect or direct, I felt a real sense or sensation of being able to communicate almost with that part in me that is almost in pain because it's not being told in a certain way, you are okay, you've done a good job. Upon having this sort of reflection, I was struck by a couple of things. The first was noticing a sort of unspoken habit to seek that validation outside of me in the negative sense. So, not in the sense where it is a secondary source of confirmation, but instead in a sense where I am waiting for somebody else to tell me I can continue on living. That sounds a bit dramatic, but really in some sense that's quite true. And not only am I waiting for that, I think I might also have been, not in that specific instance, but in general, I might have also been preparing for, what would the worst case scenario be if I didn't get that validation? What things would I need to undergo to regain said person's approval in a worst case scenario? So really going deep, the feeling that is seeking, that is almost in pain, that is seeking this validation is going to lengths to get my attention, giving me fantasies of what could go wrong. So noticing that there was this unspoken habit was it was surprising and not surprising at the same time. I know myself a little bit by now, being 29, but not as much as you'd think. However, just sort of looking at that linear narrative of, certain amount of tasks done, now where is my approval? And who is it going to come from? Seeing that sort of A, B, C causal link between those events and understanding my relationship with them and seeing that I was sort of living for others in some instances was a bit surprising, because it's so simple. If you take a moment to notice, it's quite simple, the story there. So I guess the surprising part was that I was letting myself do so, perhaps for quite a long time, perhaps since I was a kid, which is, beyond surprising, astonishing. And also beyond or after the shock. It is empowering because you can start to inquire, do I actually want to be in that narrative? Do I want to always use others as a primary source of validation? Or often, if not always? And you might find that you don't. And you might find that you want to look for other sources within you to feed that pained need. The second thing that struck me upon reflecting on all of this was how powerful you as a primary source of validation, communicating with that internal need for validation in those moments, how powerful you can be in the face of that. And then when you think about that a little bit, you realize how much you need this in your life. Me, for example, what I'd like to share about my job is that I'm in a sort of, what would we say, practice that, relatively speaking, is still within its sort of infant stage. And it deals with people who are quite experienced in their field. And our internal machine, let's say, which is the team, which is still in its infant stage, creates things that become in communication with entities that are not in the infant stage, that have been in the field for generations almost. And so there's this unique quality to what I do where there's an internal component and an external component. And perhaps this is common for many people and many people's jobs. The internal component needs us to get what we do to the best level we possibly can, to then bring it out into the world and let it interact with the external entities. No, hold on. One thing that's a part of what I do is that I communicate with the externals in a way that is of the nature of what my internal machine is, an infant. So an infant will have its own language, its own way at looking at the world. And so we communicate our work to the externals from that perspective, from that language. And sometimes the communication stops quite early into the stages of what would be considered the work between the external and the internal. All this is to say that if my job, this is my job, right? Which is something that is supposed to give me very fundamental pillar of sense of self-confidence, all these really core things. If I placed those things, self-confidence, sense of self, on the fact that just because of the nature of our age in this field versus the age of other entities we deal with in this field, and the tricky nature of the communication, and the fact that sometimes leads to a stalling of a smooth conversation. If I were to place my whole sense of self on the fact that system I just described is almost rigged to fail, and the success rate is an outlier, is the miraculous aspect, then I would collapse every time. Internally, I would collapse every time this system, which is rigged to not allow communication almost, doesn't allow communication. So I would collapse internally, my sense of self would collapse in the face of something that is naturally designed to do its thing almost every single time. So what then is the way to proceed in such a field, in such a workplace? And perhaps this is not just the nature of being in a media industry. Perhaps this is something that spreads in other verticals. I noticed in a sense that the solution was kind of something I was doing outside of the frame of this, let's say, very zoomed in conversation about internal and external validation. But it was still me looking at the work that we had done, validating it internally using different modes or methods of validation, and being able to confidently affirm that what we are doing is not only the best we're doing, but it is right in the context of our objectives, in the context of our field. And I noticed upon thinking about this that I had been doing this almost since the very beginning. So it's very interesting because a part of me in my life has often been seeking my sense of self in other people's opinions, right? But also, when there is a space when that isn't readily available or commonplace, there's an internal drive for me to create that validation for myself. And the fruits of that are, after 2 years of developing this infant machine of what we do, our work has gotten much better from various aspects in a quite noticeable way, even from the external parties who do tend to notice such things, the few who do. And again, this isn't to complain, the simplest way to put it. It is really to reflect on how do we go through complicated systems with complicated parts and keep our arrow pointing in a positive, let's say, direction without being consumed by people having different opinions. And the answer seems to be there are real ways to affirm to yourself that in the real world you are progressing, that your work is good, that you are contributing positive things in the world with your hard work, with your perhaps straying away slightly from the path, as noted by someone expressing perhaps a dislike to or a difference of opinion to something you think. Another dimension in which I've noticed that I used to seek almost purely external validation versus internal is nutrition and exercise. I noticed that I had a narrative since I was a kid that, first of all, in school, only certain types of guys get to be in, let's say, relationships with certain types of girls, whether it's how tall they are or how strong they are or how fit they are or how confident in themselves they are. And I noticed that I once sort of made a narrative out of that as though it's the real situation, which it may be confirmed in a lot of cases, right? But it's not 100% true all the time. That's something. And I also, after sort of saying, okay, this narrative is definitely 100% real all the time, I also said that's not me. That's just something to note. One other thing to note is that I think out of that narrative or around that time when, preteen, teen, puberty feelings start to be very intense for people you're attracted to, in my case, girls at the time, now women. Around that time, I noticed that some kind of narrative of I need to look a certain way and talk a certain way to to make certain people happy and like me, whether it's friends or romantic kind of situation, relationships or flings or what have you. And I think that the sort of result of that, or the baby of that narrative, was that the last few years with me moving to where I am, where there isn't much commuting on foot, plus with the rise of COVID, I gained a bunch of weight. I gained about 30 kilos, which is quite a bit. So 30 kilos ago, I wasn't skinny, but I wasn't overweight like that, And I wanted to get out of that loop, and I'm still working on it. But at the time, I wanted to get out of it to validate that narrative, to be the person who is going to look good in a certain context to certain people. And once I get those people's validation, then my life would be good. And I mean, maybe for some people that it works, or it's practical in actually motivating them to change, let's say, their habits, their eating, exercise, other kinds of habits that revolve around physique and overall well-being and health. Maybe it works for some people, but for me, this kind of narrative did not work. It wasn't enough. It wasn't strong enough to actually motivate my physical body that had built certain habits around food and when I was eating and why I was eating. That why wasn't strong enough to get me to change. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, maybe my case isn't universal, but I would like to intuit that for some people it would be relatable. That when you kind of think, oh, if I do this, this person will be happy or attracted to me, and that will make the fact of that will make me happy, that narrative is not enough to sustain you through a difficult goal that you're seeking. That's really interesting. I can't put my finger on why that's interesting yet. Perhaps it's something like you need something stronger, and maybe ideally, I mean, this would be great. Maybe you need internal validation to help you to conquer such strong and complicated goals that require lots of change over a long period of time. And so actually the work that I started doing a few months ago with a nutritionist / life coach is very much built on that kind of internal validation. You're doing this for you. You're not doing this for part of it could be for some future you specifically want, a way that you feel, a certain way that you look for you, not for somebody else, because that is something that makes you feel good when you look in the mirror. It gives off a certain indirect story about yourself. I'm someone who takes care of myself, for example. That's what you get when you look into the mirror. So there perhaps are some aspects of, okay, in the future, I'm going to be this certain thing. But, and that might be, I was thinking, okay, that might be part of why the what's it called? I'm going to make this person happy and that will make me happy narrative that makes it fail, that it's so like far in the future that I want to eat this cookie now. I don't care what's going to happen in a year when I lose all this weight. It was just a sort of intuition I had that sometimes a future goal isn't enough. But in this case, part of the work that I'm doing is built on, okay, we are heading somewhere. And that somewhere, when you imagine it, it's kind of pleasant for various reasons. The way you look, the way you feel, what you think, what your environment looks like, such things. But also then, I guess the key difference between those two is that there was a very clear now component. And that is a sense of, I am doing this because it makes me feel really good in a way that nothing else does. Nothing. Except other goal seeking that is quite close to my soul. Let's say for ease of use, so to speak. And so that's why for the first time when I've worked with a nutritionist, I found success so far. I've lost some weight. I don't care to say the number. But my clothes are looser, my face is smaller, and I feel great. And the main reason why I feel great is because I stopped doing this. I stopped pursuing changing my food habits and exercise habits for someone else in some future that has yet to happen. I'm doing it for me now, and for me in the future. That is the key reason why this is working, and it's not that much of an effort. Let's say mentally, like I don't have much resistance with myself doing this. Yes, there is some resistance. Yes, there still are cravings, old habitual cravings and old habitual triggers to eating certain foods, emotional triggers that cause, okay, oh, maybe I should grab this thing, and I need to deal with that, and that's not very straightforward or easy. But in comparison to before, when I'm going to, when I lose the 30 kilos, I'm going to be attractive enough to attract someone, and that someone's going to like me, and then I'll be happy. That was so far that it wasn't good enough to say, okay, I'm not going to eat this cookie. But when I said, oh, I want to do this because I want to feel good in my own body, and I want to rely on, in my specific case, myself and like non-food related activities to respond to the daily stresses of my life. This is one key thing I was doing. I was eating because of stress sometimes. When I started to say that to myself, I want to do this for me and to feel good right now, here and now, today, everything changed. And now every week I am taking a solid step forward, back from where I was, back from the junk food I used to eat, back from the inconsistency in my exercise, towards healthier living, healthier eating, more consistent in my exercise, better food choices, steering away from eating because of non-nutritional reasons. Every single week, my nutritionist and I have noticed a positive upward trend, or at least staying the same one of those weeks. Because why? Because our strategy, which is built by her, is based on, I want to do this for me. It is entirely revolving around that. And I think that that's sort of enough for today as a kind of exploration in a couple of dimensions in my life. Why internal validation is so goddamn important, and why external validation in the negative sense can be harmful in one sense, but also just not enough. So I invite you, for whoever's listening, to have a think about areas in your life, moments in your life in the days ahead where, hey, I noticed I'm waiting for someone outside of me to tell me I'm okay in this situation, or I'm good enough. And I want you to stop when you notice that and take a step back. Notice the physical sensation in your body. Describe it to yourself, and notice the relationship between that physical sensation and the approval you're seeking. And try to soothe that feeling in your body with your own positive thoughts about yourself. True positive thoughts and memories that you have that relate to that specific validatory validatory need and see what happens. Does the need get soothed even for a moment? Because that's noteworthy. Even if the painful sensation of I need this person's validation comes back a few moments later, the fact of it being soothed a bit is something noteworthy. And I guess just going from there, perhaps consider what other areas in your life where you haven't been attaining certain goals you want to attain. Might this perspective bring perhaps a new light, a new energy into that domain, whether it be work or food or something else, relationships? Because I think I'm not alone in this. I think I'm not alone in it's sometimes hard to design a way in which you're consistently internally validating yourself, and perhaps as a secondary confirmation using the people around you, the support system around you to as an extra thing, as an extra plus. But having that primary part sometimes is not easy because of self-doubt, because you compare yourself to others and things like that. But hey, I mean, give it a try, right? And see what happens.